Hi, my name's Phil Galloway and I'm a digital artist from the northwest of England. And in this workshop, I'll be showing you how to create a vibrant, loose and expressive portrait using the new digital art app, Adobe Fresco. Okay, so I've got Adobe Fresco open now on my iPad, and the first thing we need to do is to start a new document. So the interface on Adobe Fresco is very, very intuitive, very simple to use. You click New Document, you set your dimensions and your pixel size, and it creates the artboard for you. Pretty simple stuff, and if you know your way around any kind of art program or Photoshop, you'll be at home right away. For this workshop, I want to create a portrait in portrait mode and set the dimensions to 227 by 305, I think it was, and the pixel size to 300. So that means that I can export it at high detail, high accuracy, and it'll be good for web as well. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown before we get to the pencil stage, as I'm kind of sketching away there in the background, on the left hand side you've got your brushes, and at the top you've got your pixel brushes, which are, I think, one of the real strengths of actually Adobe Fresco. They've got some very, very nice stock brushes in there. Beneath that you've got your live brushes, which are the new kids on the block, really, the paint effect, like watercolor and chunky paint. And there's a few other art apps that do it maybe a little bit better, but it's certainly a good first go from Adobe Fresco. And as you'll see here, the levels of realism that you can achieve are pretty high. And then underneath that is vector brushes, which I don't go into in this tutorial at all. That's more for kind of graphic work, which is not really what I do. So as you can see, I'm busy penciling in my portrait, and for this workshop I will be drawing a man with paint running down his face, which sounds a little bit odd, but I chose this because I wanted to show as many painterly techniques as I could to kind of raise that level of realism, to see what Adobe Fresco could really do. I mean, it's pretty fresh out. Adobe Fresco, it's only been out for a month or two, and I really wanted to put it through its paces and leave a lot of my working through and show the brush strokes and everything like that. So I thought it was a good kind of scene to do. So as you can see, I am sketching out. I usually put a line at the top and a line where the chin is, just to kind of act as a guide, and then loosely start putting flesh there, you know what I mean, drawing the shapes out. I'm not worrying about mistakes at this stage at all. I'm just loosely using the stock pencil brush from the pixel brushes. So for the final portrait, I want some of these pencil lines to kind of show through, and I want to show my working a little bit. Again, to create a bit of movement underneath the paint and a little bit of interest, but also just to kind of show that realism that we were speaking about a minute ago. So I'm not too worried about leaving errant lines or mistakes. I'm going to leave it all in from the sketch pretty much. I barely will use an eraser at this stage at all. Now, everyone has different techniques and approaches of how they go about doing, particularly portraits. You know, from children to professional artists, there's a different way of kind of going at it. And there's no right or wrong, whatever works for you. I'm not one to use too many kind of traditional means. You see a lot of artists using circles and lines and to build up the kind of form. I use them as rough guides, but mainly we'll just kind of feel it out as I go. I'll, like I said, put a line at the top where I want the top of the head to be, a line where the chin and maybe an angle of a shoulder, and then a centre line through the nose and mouth. But generally I'll just kind of draw it as I see it, and that's the way I've always worked. Some people like to have a little bit more structure to this side of things, and that's fine, but don't ever feel that your technique is wrong or you're doing it, you know, others are doing it in the right way. Whatever works for you is always going to be the best way. So as you can see now here, I am using the transform tool, which again, if you're familiar with Photoshop, this will be second nature. But on the left hand side, there's a little cross with a cursor icon, and you can select, you know, everything on there, or you can lasso a certain area and move it about. I quickly realized that the head was going to be a little bit too large on the canvas, so just resized it down, and that works really, really well without any loss of quality. So now that I'm getting a little bit more of the detail in there, this is where the kind of Apple Pencil really kind of starts to show its strengths, because the tilt to shade works superbly well in Adobe Fresco. And as you can see, as I'm leaning the pencil to one side, you get those lovely chunky pencil strokes, which really, are pretty realistic even under close scrutiny. And it just means you can work so fast, so expressive, little flicks, just like I would, work on a piece of A4 paper or A3 paper with maybe a chunky pencil or a piece of charcoal. It's got that same kind of intuitive feel. It feels quite second nature, and the pencil really works well with Fresco. Okay, so I'm nearly completed my pencil sketch. I've kept it loose. Again, I'm not too worried. A lot of the detail I can put in at the painting stage if it needs be, but I want to leave some of these shading lines coming through the paint, as I said before, as if, you've painted over charcoal base on a canvas or your pencil. So you, again, using the tilt to shade, just forming the outside lines before we move on to the next stage of adding texture beneath there, and something to kind of build the paint upon. Now that I've refined my sketch and I'm happy with it, I want to add a texture, a ground on which to build upon. And so on the left hand side, you'll see a little gallery icon, the little picture just above the black dot there. And if you select that, you can import from your gallery or your photos or some other file storage. And so I selected this stock texture, which I obtained from Pixabay, which is a great free stock reference for all your images if you ever need them. And you basically drag it in and resize it, and it just adds, again, that little bit of mess, a little bit of texture beneath before I start painting on it. So as you can see now, I'm adding a little bit of paint to that texture on a new layer. I've pressed the plus button on the right hand side, added a new layer. I've selected the live brush tool, which is the one with the little water drop on the left hand side, and gone for the one of the oil paint brushes, which add like a little bit of texture and movement, and you can blend them on the screen in front of you. It is quite amazing to see, and it really does work very well, to be fair. And for this one, I choose the oil paint short brush. And what I try to do is just pick colours which are vibrant, which will show through underneath, but don't, detract from the painting. I just wanted to keep it loose, messy, so you'll see the pinks and yellows. I want the final image to become quite a modern take on the portrait. So I work loosely, I work swiftly using the oil paint short brush before starting then to fill in a little bit more detail and blocking in colours. As you can see, I'm now starting to block in the main elements of colour across the page and across the face. Using again the live brushes and the oil paint short tool, I'm just picking out the main kind of colour areas I want to focus on. Not all of the painting, when it's finished, is going to be painted. I want to leave a few of those lines coming through. So using the colour wheel on the left hand side, I'm just picking quite flat colour really, just to kind of show me where I want to build upon. I've created a new layer on the right hand side. Oh, and just as a little tip here, you might see on the right hand side there that I have a very faint pencil layer on top. And this is a little trick that I do, and it helps me to kind of keep my painting on track, if you will. So basically what I would do is select the pencil layer and duplicate it. So to do that, you select it and then select the three dots on the side, and it gives you the option, or you can just tap on the layer, duplicate layer, and then the new layer of the pencils, I set the opacity, so you can see the little adjuster sliders on the right, at the top right hand side. You click on there and you adjust the sliders down to maybe between 40 and 50 opacity, and I put that layer on top. And so anything I paint will be underneath that. So even if I start going crazy with paint, I can throw it about. I still know the kind of constraints to work within, and I'm not just covering over the pencil and losing my portrait, if you will. So it means I can be really expressive at this stage before kind of hammering down the detail. And when I hammer down the detail, I can then delete or just hide the top pencil layer, the guide layer, and you're left with hopefully what should look like quite an accurate painting. So most of the blocking in is now done really, and you'll see in a second that I switch to the oil paint filbert brush, which is a kind of wispy little edged brush which you can change the settings on the left hand side. Within each brush, whether it's live or pixel, you can alter the flow, the structure of it, the spacing on Adobe. And with the filbert brush, you might have just seen me just go into the settings there a little bit. I lower down the flow a little bit so it creates more textured, wispy edges to the brushstroke. And so you'll see I just start loosely feathering in the brushstrokes really, just to kind of give that, again, that element of realism before we start getting onto the more chunky paint going on top. I now switch to the oil paint chunky brush, and this is where we really start to put the flesh on the bones, if you will. And the oil paint chunky brush, I think, is one of the winners really in Adobe Fresco. It's one of the best. It's the one that kind of you see the most texture and structure within the brush strokes, and you can really start building it up, and it creates little moments of interest within your brush strokes. So basically, again, I'm just trying to pick out areas of highlights, shadows. Nothing too detailed. I'm trying to keep it quite loose, again, as if I was painting it more in an alla prima style, a bit more quicker. But you'll see that I'm just testing it out a little bit, trying to get the right texture. I tweaked the settings a little bit so the flow is reasonably high. I didn't want it too dry of the brush. But aside from that, I kept the pretty much to kind of the standard stock Adobe Fresco chunky brush. And basically just start kind of loosely painting and sketching in the areas of interest, again zooming in, zooming out to see if it looks right, and just starting to build up the face and the flesh tones. I want the final portrait to be very vibrant and kind of bright, not garish, but to have a life about it. And so you'll see me now. I choose to paint in quite bright oranges, and bear in mind that these are obviously below the pencil line, which are kind of dulling them a little bit, but these will really sing through when I add in the more details and the skin tones on top in a little while, and really kind of make the light play off the top of his forehead and his shoulder. So again, it looks a little bit odd and very red at this stage, but my paintings always go through a period, and I'm sure everyone would appreciate this, and maybe other artists kind of go through the same, where it will always look worse before it gets better, and it goes through a period around this stage where it things look flat or dull or messy or garish or whatever it might be. And you've just got to persevere and know that once you start adding those details and the multiplies and the shadows and the highlights, it really will all come together. So as you can see, once you start adding those kind of more grounded flesh tones and the dark colours, those garish colours that we used before don't seem so garish now, and you see little flourishes of them, of the reds and the oranges popping through. Again, I studied Baroque art for my master's degree, and it was all about Caravaggio and painters like that. They painted on an orange background, a ground, and you'd see a little bit of that shining through. And I suppose that's kind of, sometimes I will paint a background entirely orange or red and then paint on top of that. But I suppose in a little way, because I didn't want all this painting to be coloured in the background. I wanted some areas just to see the paper texture and that we applied earlier on. So I suppose in a way, me putting the orange down and those yellows was that little kind of nod to that technique, I suppose. So we're fast approaching adding, you know, some real lowlights and highlights and pinning down some detail. But I'm still using the chunky brush, just feeling my way out, experimenting a little bit with some colours and lines and shades. Again, the joy of digital art is you're not making a mess, you're not getting in trouble for getting paint all over the house, but also any mistakes, you just hit that undo button, or you tap with your finger twice on the screen, tap with your fingers, 2 fingers on the screen, and it takes you back. If you want to redo, you put 3 fingers on the screen and tap, and it goes back to what it was before. It's very intuitive. And again, if you've used any other art programs on the iPads, like Procreate and things like that, there's a lot of gestures that are very similar. So for this next step, this is where I start adding a few little highlights, little flares, adding a little bit of detail, really kind of getting tight into the picture now, and just making the areas where I want there to be detail to be as detailed as possible, and so they sit comfortably next to the areas of looseness. I did that little squiggle across his mouth, and I initially thought, oh, I might erase that and lose it, but I thought there was something about it with the grey lips kind of behind it. I thought it was added a nice juxtaposition to the red paint coming down his face, and I thought if I did colour his lips it might be too much red. So that kind of, as Bob Ross says, these little happy accidents, I decided to keep it in, and maybe it altered the way my approach for the rest of the painting. I then thought, okay, well, if we're leaving that in, I can be a bit more expressive. I can even go further with the looseness and really try and create a piece that kind of has a life about it and a vibrancy, and not isn't just a bog standard photorealistic or semi-realistic painting of a man with paint on his face. It actually becomes a little bit more, and hopefully a piece of artwork which I'll be happy with by the end of it. Now the next step was to make the red paint on his face seem more believable, more three-dimensional, like it's actually kind of enveloping his face, and you can see the contours underneath. And the reference image I'd seen, it looked almost unctuous, the paint kind of coming down his face. And so at the moment I thought it's looking a little bit flat. So on a new layer, I basically created a new layer specifically for adding the detail to the red paint, and it was all about getting that kind of glossy sheen look, and through choosing different shades of the kind of crimson and red next to very, very bright pinks, you kind of create the kind of undulation, as if it is actually wrapping around his face. And it was definitely worth taking a little bit more time on this area. So as you'll see, I'll start getting in tight to it and really, really trying to find the right approach of tackling it. And again, experimentation, no fear of trying something new, keep plugging away at it is definitely the way forward, and you'll find, you know, it will work for you in the end. So as you can see, I'm using bright little colours to kind of suggest the cheekbone and the eyelids of where the kind of highlight would be, and it's not all work, some work, and I erase and come back. As you can see there, I pressed the button on the side, which is the touch shortcut tool. You may have wondering what that dot was sat on the screen all the way through this, but basically it's a contextual button, which is, I've not seen anything really like this on any other drawing app, but basically depending on the brush you're using, whether it be pixel, live or vector, when you press it, it then changes the use of the brush in your hand. So if on the live brushes, when you press it, basically you paint with clear, as if adding, I suppose, turpentine to your screen, and you can push the paint around a little bit and blend it. If you're using it with the pixel brushes and you press it, you erase using the brush that you were previously using, which is actually really, really good. And you'll see at the end of this tutorial that I use it to kind of bite into the paint by selecting a texture brush, whether it be ink splatters or even, you know, a dry brush would work. And then when you press that button, it erases in the style of this. Now I know I've seen you can choose how to erase on other apps, but it's quite nice that you can just quickly press that button and either kind of push the paint around, or if you're using the pixel brushes, erase, you know, immediately using the brush you were using. Which if I was to erase just with a normal brush at the top of this, it would look blunt and flat next to the emotive brushstrokes, and I didn't want that. So being able to erase in a texture is a great addition to the app. Okay, so now that I've got my highlights and my lowlights and my shadows and my texture all done on the portrait, I really want to enhance that a little bit further by using a multiply layer. So on the right hand side, I click a new layer by pressing the plus button, and then change the layer properties to blend, set it to multiply. To do that, you click the little dial slider at the top right hand side and select the blend option and multiply, and then I turn the opacity down to between 40 and 50. Anything higher and it starts taking over the painting, anything lower and it's not really affecting it. So once you've done that, I select a kind of mid-tone of each colour, so a mid-red for the paint, a mid-flesh tone, kind of ochre colour for the skin, and a mid-brown for the hair, and just begin kind of almost kind of feathering in the shadows. You'll see me doing his hairline there, and what that does is it just adds another level of depth. It really kind of, I do it on all my paintings, and it particularly on skin, it makes it more rounded and more believable as an actual kind of painting. With my multiply layer done now, I want to kind of add a bit of chaos into the picture. If I was painting this for real, there would be oil splatting everywhere and dribbling down, and I want to kind of create that again to enhance that realism that we keep kind of coming back to, but also it just adds movement and flow to a painting. So I create a new layer, and again in the live brushes selection on the left hand side, I actually select watercolor this time and the watercolor splatter, and throw a few little splatters around and for his freckles on his nose. And then you can see now I've switched to the pixel brushes on the left hand side, and I'm experimenting with a few different kind of looks and feels. I want to kind of add almost a little bit of graffiti to it. So and a little bit of grunge in that. So I find a brush called the Ruffin brush, which, and with this pink, it's a great little brush for these little dry, loose brush strokes, and you can really kind of, it lets enough of the painting beneath kind of come through, but it just adds that interest and that kind of modern fluidity to it. So as you can see there, I'm zooming in, and that Ruffin brush is fantastic. I then choose the in the pixel brushes, the FX category and the ink splat, and I start kind of throwing around the paint, if you will. So here's the ink splat one, and you get these lovely little kind of trails of paint and ink that splatters off, and the harder you press, the more splatter you get. But also a nice little effect that you can do, and you'll see me do it in a second, is if you ramp up the size hugely, ink splash, and draw next to the canvas, so not actually on your canvas. As you can see here, you can the ink splash you can get it kind of cascading across the canvas without actually seeing the line, and that's a lovely effect. You'll see it with the white in a second, and I just wanted to kind of, as if I'd flicked paint from the side of the canvas, just to kind of come and encroach upon it. And so it's definitely worth experimenting with the pixel brushes. I think Adobe have done a fantastic job. I know they hired a digital artist to kind of help them with the brushes used. I think it was Kyle Webster, and there you go with the white splashing on, you can see, and they've done a really good job. They're very believable, and you know, they come in handy and really sit well next to the kind of painted tools. So it's definitely worth experimenting and playing around with those. So I've got all my textures now laid down, and I'm really happy with the way it's looking. And I've added a slight little frame area around the outside in that kind of turquoisey dark green. And you'll see me now using the erase with brush, using the touch shortcut tool I was mentioned earlier. And this is where I just kind of eat into the canvas a little bit, and on different layers, just bite back texture, and just to, again, it kind of adds that weather beaten look. And so I don't want a solid frame. I wanted it to look like it's almost been stamped and a dry brush being raked across the canvas. And so that works really well. I'm dead happy. And you know, all that's left really is for me to sign the picture. So I choose a brush that I quite like, go down to the corner and sign my piece. Once my painting is finished, it's automatically saved in Adobe Fresco, but then you can choose what to do with it. And they've got a nice little thing with the little square with the arrow in the top right hand corner. You can do a quick export, and it's just called quick export, and you press it and you can save straight to your photo stream or your gallery, and it's great for if you just need to quickly share to a client or to you know, whatever you might be doing, or to just track progress. So you click that and quick export, and then if you really want to export as a different thing, as a PNG, a JPEG, a PSD or a PDF, you click the save file, publish and export button, and off you go, and it's saved. So hopefully you've seen a little bit into my process. I think it's all about experimenting and keeping it loose and seeing what works for you. But I think Adobe Fresco is definitely worth a look. It's a great new addition to any artist's arsenal, and I think there's some way to go in improving that. I think they can really build on this good start, but have a look at what other artists are doing using it, and have a play and see what you can kind of create. And again, mix those brushes, mix the pixel brushes with the live brushes, and I think you'll have a lot of fun creating some beautiful, hopefully beautiful pieces of artwork. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll get to do another video soon. Thanks.